thank you for joining us here today, and also let you know that we are recording this session. If you're not comfortable being recorded, please have your video off, and you can also message us in the chat if you've got any concerns around the recording. But we do have a really packed session here today, showcasing some of our Humanitech Lab work. So we might kick straight off and hopefully the room fills as we're going. In Australia, we recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and we'd like to pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodians across the country, to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly to pay respects to any First Nations people joining us in this session today. I'm joining here today from the lands of the Paramount people and would like to pay my respects. If you're also joining from First Nations or Indigenous land, you might like to pay your respects in the chat as well. We would like to let you know that this presentation might contain the names or images of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals who have since passed. I'll start us off with a little explanation of what Humanitech is. Australian Red Cross established Humanitech in 2018. And our point of difference is that we are a think and do tank that leverages technology innovation to work on solving humanitarian challenges. So it's a very exciting new space for us, looking at how innovation and working with technologists as well as humanitarians and social innovators can reach people that are most vulnerable and really scale the work of the Red Cross movement. And so today we're bringing a number of our wonderful Humanitech Lab startup collaborators to share some of the cutting edge work that they are doing to solve some really complex humanitarian problems using technology innovation. So we will get straight into it, and I'd like to start us off by introducing Joe Glester from Climasens to share a bit about his work. Please, as we're going, pop any questions that you have in the chat, and there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A with each of our speakers as we go. I will hand over now to Joe. Thank you very much.
Hey, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Joe Glesta, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Climasens. We are a climate risk analytics startup who participated in the Humanitech program last year. So we're the scale-up winner, and luckily for us, we got to kick off our relationship with the Australian Red Cross in about 2021. So today I'll be talking about our process from inception to validation to scale, and how we partnered with the Red Cross to identify climate risks to communities across Australia. So, slide. So the title of this is From Climate Data to Climate Action, and the perspective that we have on this is both from the Red Cross and as Climasens. So I'll be speaking on behalf of Eilish, who is our partner and our point of contact at Red Cross. So next slide, please. So we worked with the Australian Red Cross's TeleReady team, and that team basically was tasked with identifying and supporting vulnerable communities who are at risk to heat. And so the ways in which Red Cross engaged those communities was finding them, getting forms, community workshops, and understanding who these people are. And then when the heat waves came, give them a call, see how they're doing, assess if they need help, and support them that way. Next slide, please. This system, although effective when engaged, the difficulty was finding these people in the first place and then being able to engage them proactively. So who are these people and how at risk are they? Was the big question that we sought to solve with the Red Cross. Next slide, please. What the Australian Red Cross needed was tools to help them identify who was at risk, where that risk is going to be, and then information support to help them plan, prepare, and respond to the impacts of heat. Next, please. So what we did was work with the Australian Red Cross to build out a platform that helped users understand exactly where these risks would be. We mapped vulnerability across all of Australia down to a 1 kilometer grid to help the Red Cross assess who these people are. We used a variety of different indicators for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So think of that as Australia's warehouse of census information, which helped us understand exactly who these different socioeconomic and demographics are and how vulnerable they could potentially be. In doing so, we lit up Australia like a Christmas tree. We were looking at pockets of risk and heat and vulnerability, and collectively, we were able to ascertain where these communities were most at risk. Next slide, please. So where we started was the simple question of, what's your problem? And we are looking at a problem shared across many different industries and not just the Red Cross. But what we landed on was important because it was impactful across government, across industry, and the Red Cross specifically. We then piloted the technology with the Red Cross to basically assess what was going on. Could it work? Could we actually engage effectively to make something tangible? And then successfully, we managed to understand that this was a serious use case and one that could have massive implications for the organization at large, which led us to scale. So that's the story of the Red Cross and the Climasens work that we've done together. And that was all through the Humanitech Lab that helped facilitate this process and helped us grow together. It was a really, really helpful and useful way for us as a startup to engage. So I'm going to jump into what we're doing beyond this, because that was really what got our feet on the ground and started getting us into overdrive. The community challenge that we sought to fix in Australia alone is also something much more prolific. And so what we're trying to solve today is understanding how we can help organizations across the world, not just the Red Cross, but humanitarian organizations, governments, consultancies, those who are planning, designing, and building our cities, understand what risks they face now and into the future. Next slide, please. So what we're doing is building out this climate risk and analytics platform. And what that does is provide all the information you need to assess what's at risk, where it's going to be at risk, and when it will be at risk. We use a collection of past, present, and future data, which helps you assess what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. And in doing so, we're providing transparency on where risk will be most present to all vulnerable and non-vulnerable populations all across the world. Next slide, please. What really makes us special within this marketplace is that we've been focusing on heat. And some of you might actually be in Europe or US or other parts of the world right now experiencing severe heat. Us in Melbourne, a severe cold right now, so not an issue. But we know that this year is going to be terrible in terms of summer, and it's only going to get worse. And so we've built something that's specifically focused on heat. And what we'll be doing is focusing on various elements of climate risk into the future as well. Next slide, please. So our whole emphasis and our mission was to transform climate risk to resilience. And that to us means turning data to action. And so working with the Australian Red Cross, we were able to essentially turn what was a lot of different data types into something actionable, helping the Red Cross essentially understand exactly where to target actions, set up base, assess where the future communities would be at risk, design programs that can help support and improve interactions with communities who are at risk as well. So yeah, a software platform that's full of data. It's a little bit pretty, but at the end of the day, what I like to say is we're giving superheroes superpowers. So that's a really important part of what we're trying to do here, is providing the information that backs all this. So where we go to from here is important. Australia was the starting point, and now we're looking to go globally. We see an opportunity in US and Europe that will help us launch in those areas. And so we're going to be going beyond heat to multi-hazard risk, and also focused on people, places, and assets. So it won't just be looking at vulnerable communities, but the places they inhabit and the infrastructure and housing around them, so we can get a full view on what's at risk. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think that's probably enough information to provide for everyone for today, and it's probably at time. So I'll leave some time for questions, if there's any.
Thanks, Joe. And while our audience is thinking about their questions, please add them into the chat as they come up. I'll kick off with one. We've got a global audience here today, and it is really exciting to hear that you're looking to move beyond your work in Australia and into the global context. Can you share a bit about what you're heading next and what support Climasens needs to go global, and where are you planning on taking Climasens next?
Thanks, Julia. Look, what we're looking for are opportunities to work with organizations who are working with vulnerable communities. We want to help them illuminate where these risks are. Specifically, we're walking into Europe early next year, and the US. And so we'll be in some major cities like Barcelona, Berlin, Luxembourg, London, and Paris. But what that means is by starting to gather data within those areas, we can also start to work in other areas within the EMEA. So Europe, the Middle East, and Africa as well. The US is also the next stop on that. Those who are IFRC in the US, which good luck, it would be really early in the morning for you. We will be in the US and have US coverage very shortly as well.
That's so exciting. To our audience, if you are in any of those locations, or even if you're not, if you're somewhere else and you want to hear more about the Climasens platform, please reach out to us. We'll have our details at the end, and we can put you in contact with Joe and make some of those important connections. One more question for you, Joe. The Climasens work is bringing amazing data capabilities into a humanitarian organisation like Red Cross. And as humanitarians, we know it's so important to have good data and evidence driving our work and driving our service delivery. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned around translating some of that data into making it useful, and particularly making it easy to use for frontline staff and people who are working directly with communities that are really passionate about giving the best service that they can, and the ability of data to use that, but a bit around the capability build and how you're helping us to do that in an easy way?
Well, that was a big question. Look, I think really what it comes down to is we wanted to create something extremely simplistic, because those within the humanitarian sector aren't always well versed in data analytics platforms. Look, I wasn't. It takes a bit of an uplift to understand that. And so building something simplistic, not in terms of requiring a lot of understanding of how to navigate something quite deep, but getting that information directly in your hands, visualizing it, and being able to use it both from a spatial standpoint, which is often what we see in the humanitarian sector. So you want a bird's eye view of where things are going to happen. And then you also want the analysis behind it, so that when you go to make those decisions, you're backed up. You have everything you need to explore that. So we've been working with the Red Cross through a couple different engagements, a few workshops to help provide some capability uplift in the platform. We've been also co-designing the platform with Red Cross and different organizations within these sectors to help better, make it fit for purpose. We think there's endless possibilities of something like this, but realistically, you got to start somewhere, and you got to be strong with the first couple moves you take. And so what we saw immediately was in the Red Cross, for example, there was capability to get early warning detection, although it was on a different platform. There was some capability to assess where people were at risk minorly, but it was on a different platform. There was no capability to understand climate change risk, but we brought it in. So everything together provides a very clear picture of what risk is. And in doing so, made it, say, objectively, a lot easier to plan, prepare, and respond to what would be actual disasters and will be disasters now and into the future.
And we've got a question from the audience, from Viva Oliver. Could we have a practical example of where data has been influencing action in a particular community?
Sure. I'll speak directly to a city close to home here. The city of Melbourne is using our data to effectively understand exactly where these vulnerable communities are. And now we are working with the city to help identify adaptations that we can start to use within those areas and monitor those adaptations so that communities can actually see a benefit. And so the first step of what we provided was the evidence base to say, it's not good here and it's not good enough and we need to do something. And oftentimes that's a missing link for those within these areas. And so in many ways, this is becoming almost like an investment tool. It's used to identify the risk so someone could do something about it. And that's usually the hardest thing to get for any type of adaptation, resilience, and or community-led project. So that's how it's being led right now and used with the city of Melbourne. Yarra Trams is also using data to assess where hotspots are so they can improve their infrastructure as well for communities across the city. 2 examples.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Joe. We'll move now to our next speaker, which will be Jason Davis from Hold Access. Joe will be staying on the line and we might have a chance at the end of the session for some extra questions. So keep your questions coming as you think of them. We'll bring Jace up on screen. Here he is. And Kayla's just bringing our presentation back up. Seamless. I'll hand over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Okay. Next slide. Next slide. So how important is your identity? Does your home define you? I want you to think about this. Is your identity as important as your children in your family? Because identity to me means multiple things. I'm known by multiple names: my tribal name, my bush name, my skin name or moiety, my tribal name, my birth name, my central dreaming name as well. Yet none of these names are defined in the systems that utilize the modern day services. Next slide. What this does, it prevents me from interacting with these modern day systems. In fact, this is a complex problem felt throughout the world. There are more than 2 billion people around the world serviced by people and organizations like Red Cross and volunteers who are without identification and who are annually creating new ways to identify them and replacing instant documentation for these individuals constantly, with 4 billion people unable to access their capabilities. Next slide. So what this does, it means that people in Australia like Stan have to go through 10 steps to get to his information to create an opportunity. In fact, what happens in step 1 is he receives a call for information. He then has to go to a third party to email his documents from someone who has an email platform or an account, or even able to find his own account. So step 3, he goes to the third party to access that information from the organisation that has emailed the third party. Then he has to print the documents, have it signed by an authorised group, photocopy it, place it on a scanner where he can access a USB. Then he has to transfer this to another email, share that email with the service. The task goes on and on until at the very end, Stan has to borrow money to afford the travel, the document purchase, repurchasing, phone credit, and food to replace his documentation, whether it be identification or certificates to prove his identity and capabilities. So the deadline to lost opportunities occurs, and this is a reoccurring cycle for the underserved in Australia and throughout the world. In fact, 9 in 10 people who are unemployed Indigenous in Australia do not have access to their email or electronic documents, having to be replaced constantly. Next slide. So how does this affect services like Red Cross and organisations throughout Australia and the world? Well, it takes 60 to 90% of administration budgets to actually fill these gaps, to chase information constantly. But what this does is it creates client dependency on these services, an unskilled population that cannot hold on to their information to prove who they are in order to break away those dependency cycles. What the organisations are telling us is that they keep striving to do better, but nothing changes. Next slide. What we've created is WANA. WANA is a one-step process. It allows individuals to consent to a shared request with an organisation from anywhere. They're able to have their information and hold on to it in any environment where there is no internet, where there is internet, and share that information digitally or not, or in an analog environment. Next slide. So what we're building is a new world with digital self-determination. Transitioning opportunities digitally, where people are able to hold on to identification as a key to unlock the door to engage their opportunity. So people like Stan are able to self-determine independently and navigate through identity to skills, capabilities, and into an opportunity from anywhere in any environment, enabling a two-world solution that mobilizes people very quickly and enables digital self-determination. Next slide. So what does it look like? Well, it's a WANA app. There is a WANA software and a WANA card. WANA means to make informed choices. It comes from a 60,000-year-old technology called the message stick. It survived the oldest culture in the world. Stan is now able to transact his identification along with his electronic documents in seconds from anywhere, helping HR administration to resolve all the resource costs and to channel the funds in other areas of the organisation where they can actually get real traction to help people and communities. Next slide. Hold access is there when you need it most. Again, we are about digital self-determination, saving administration resources, increasing your service outcomes in a one-step process from anywhere, with or without the internet, helping people who are vulnerable in vulnerable locations, emergency and disaster relief where everything's lost. People can rebuild their lives without the strain and onset of trauma that can be resolved faster and easier when funds are channeled into the services that people need to move on. Next slide. There is no greater gift in life than to self-determine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jace. And I will kick off with a question for our audience. If you've got any questions for Jace, please pop them in the chat. Jace, through the Humanitech Lab, you validated this solution with some young people in the Northern Territory through the education system. So really interesting to be able to test it directly with users and that it's been designed with the young people that might benefit from it. Can you tell us a bit about some of the feedback that you received through testing it with young people?
Yeah, thank you. Some of the feedback came back was that actually people liked the fact that they had all their information in one place, that they didn't need to go to a third party who would often take their information during their project funding periods and hold on to it on their behalf. So this meant that when school leavers were graduating or leaving school early, they didn't have access to that information. And that meant identification in order to get a license, to go on and do a training course or a TAFE college skill set, or any form of unlock that first identification key would provide. And the second would be that having all the information in one place meant that it traveled with them and they didn't need to carry around a mobile phone or other resources in order to hold on to that information. The school was much better off because they were able to achieve self-determination but build the confidence of students. And the teachers were also feeling valued, that they were actually passing on a valuable tool that could empower students into the next generation, as well as beyond the school, so they could transition into real opportunities like employment or training or further skills.
Thanks, Jace. And Red Cross has been so excited to be able to work with you and pilot this solution. But we'd love, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear a bit about what are the next steps. So what's next for the team? What are you kind of looking to do next? And do you see global opportunities for this technology?
Thanks. That's a really, really good question. And it's something that I started off with the vision in my head at the very beginning of seeing this as a real world global problem that we all face, people of culture, people from diverse backgrounds, who often have to leave their culture at the door when they walk into new countries or nations as refugees or migrants. With this piece of technology, they're able to walk into other nations with all their capabilities at their fingertips, so they can go on and access opportunities for jobs, to transition into welfare and services that are publicly available to everybody. So this was our vision. And at the moment, what we're doing is we're running through trials this year with some of the larger organisations in Australia who can actually, like Red Cross and some other NGOs, to create a real industry pioneered technology that can actually disrupt the whole industry with technology that empowers people and organisations. One of the key insights we've actually come across during our pilots with Humanitech and throughout this year is that we are now categorising ourselves as a RegTech for diversity, and taking on that new position enables us to be a full stack of identification and capability information that people often don't get access to, but in everywhere else, every other society, it's just sometimes can be taken for granted. But people with culture often place more value on families, communities, and interacting and engaging together and supporting each other, where sometimes Western technologies can all be all about competitive value, about individualization or innovation after innovation after innovation. But what we're doing is creating a holistic tool that is able to balance out your health priorities, balance out your skill sets, inform all the different ways you identify yourself, whether it be when you're on country, performing ceremonies, or when you're at work as a tradesman or a professional. It enables you to be who you are, wherever you are, without the unconscious bias that might creep in institutions where it shouldn't never be. So yeah, our future looks wide, and we're open to all sort of opportunities that are amongst some of our participants in around the world to access potential pilots for next year and end of this year. So yeah, very exciting times.
And we've got a question from the audience. Are you able to give some examples of how this has facilitated employment opportunities? Or I know it's still in the pilot and design phase, so how do you see this facilitating employment opportunities into the future?
Yeah, for sure. We actually, when we first started, we actually created a platform with limited digital integration. They did have some, and at that very early stage, we did have proof of concept where one of our early users, who was actually a doctor of all people, an Indigenous doctor from the other side of Australia, gained an opportunity for employment. He left all his documents back in Western Australia. He travelled to the other side of Australia for this job in a remote community, and he forgot all his documents. He called me up and asked me for the documentation. I said, well, look, I actually want you to use the platform, so I'm not sending you anything. So he went onto the platform, and I called him back in 5 minutes, and he said, that was awesome. It got me a job. It got me the working. HR needed the documentation urgently. They received it. I was able to start. I said, so what were the problems that could have happened? And he said, well, the community would have been without a doctor, and it would have taken more than a month to have me start because I would have had to fly back to where I came from, and that would have been the cost that they would have had to supply. And so my professional integrity would be in question. Another example was a guy in the lower region of New South Wales was out fishing, and he was a First Nations person. He came across some water police who were monitoring permits, fishing permits on the sea, and they asked him, and they were going to give him an on-the-spot fine, but he said, look, I'm a First Nations person. This is my right to hunt and gather. We've been doing it for 60,000 years. So they asked him for proof. He presented the card, and they let him go. This would have had a problem of a flow-on to social determinant issues, such as serving out his time in jail in order to pay out the fine or community services. He would have also missed having income for the household as a primary breadwinner, fuel for the vehicle to get to work, so on and so forth. These are the real struggles and real issues of people who are in lower income brackets, who need this platform, who need the ability to self-determine without services over-controlling that information. And that's exactly what we do. And we've proven it.
Thanks so much, Jace. Keep your questions coming, and if we've got time, we will jump back into some at the end. Now we'll invite Priyanka Ashraf to come and share with us about Maya Cares and the fabulous work that they are doing.
Thank you, Julia. Ready when you are. Great. So I'm Priyanka Ashraf. My pronouns are she, her. I am joining from the lands of the Bunurong, Bunwurrung, and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. My heritage is Bangladeshi. So Maya Cares is a digital big sis supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Black, and women of color respond to and heal from the effects of racism. Next slide. I'm not going to perform my experiences of racial trauma that led to the development of this solution. What I will say is that the journey of creating Maya Care starts with me in a grocery store aisle in the middle of the pandemic and being told to take the COVID-19 virus with me when I go back to where I came from. These are not one-off incidents, but what I would like to share is that $44.9 billion, that is the cost of racism each year to Australia. The scope of the cost to other countries has not been what we have been looking at. Now, that is the cost that we know of, but due to the impact of shame as a result of racism, there is a severe lack of reporting. Now, when we suppress traumatic events, of course, our mental health deteriorates. And the inability to effectively process racism means that we internalize it, and it ends up getting perpetuated at a systemic level, and that's what the diagram is depicting. Now, what we've also identified is that those that are hardest hit are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Black and women of color. And examples of this in Australia include Asian Australian women bearing the brunt of COVID-19 racism. So we are on an urgent mission for racial justice. Next slide. We'll have a video on the next slide, but before we hit play, I want to further elaborate that Maya Cares is a chatbot and a resource library and offers various support mechanisms for women who have experienced racism. And now I'd like to introduce you to her. If we can please press play. Thank you. Next slide. So this is what happened next. Aside from the press, we've also heard from various organizations that are designing products or services for communities that are reaching out to us to ask for help around how do we take an effective decolonial approach towards developing products and services that specifically support vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. Our approach has been grounded in the humanity first principles, in particular, moving at the speed of trust, empowering people and communities, and last but certainly not least, safeguarding data and privacy. Next slide. In the video, you would have seen that we had engaged 250 different women from our communities. That number is now at over 300. And we strongly believe that succeeding slowly is what trumps failing fast. And when we travel at the speed of trust, we actually work with our communities who are over-consulted, yet underserved. And this took a process. This was a 2-year process to engage the right number of women to create Maya Cares, to co-create Maya Cares. Now, we are the community and we work with community. So we have, in fact, created a solution that works for community. Next slide. 92%. We validated that Maya Cares is a truly supportive resource. This is the satisfaction score achieved for our product compared to the industry average of technology products for 70%. Feeling supported and validated is what lays the groundwork to speak up. But why would you speak up when the laws don't deliver justice? This was a key insight from our users that helped us identify what the real problem is when it comes to racism and how Maya can play a role in solving it. Users trust Maya with their stories and data, and this means that we can start to build the evidence base to solve the real problem, which is legal reform. At the same time, there's another question. Should the labor of reporting even be on us? Not everyone wants to report, and that's okay. That is why when we co-created Maya Cares, we ensured that she also offered other forms of support. So in addition to reporting racism, users can also use Maya to access and locate culturally appropriate mental health resources and practitioners. In the Australian context, this is a particular valuable resource because there is a huge barrier to access culturally appropriate mental health services in Australia. This slide speaks to our conversion rates at 9%. That is about 3 times the industry average. Next slide. Now, we talked about how Maya offers various pathways to offer support. One of the conversational pathways with the chatbot is a physical grounding exercise if you are experiencing a racial trauma response. Now, we never intended for Maya to offer therapeutic support, but we did want to experiment and see whether this could be a possibility. And to our surprise, this conversation actually had an 80% completion rate. Now, what I want you to consider is that the industry average for any chatbot completion is 68.9%. And typically chatbots are answering questions like, why hasn't my mail arrived on time? Maya is being used specifically to try and navigate mental health concerns. Now, to do this in Australia with a therapist will cost you at least $150 an hour, which is not very accessible. And this is what truly excites us for the future of technology in creating access to necessary supports in innovative ways. Next slide. So what do the people say? There is as much racism happening on the streets as there is in the workplace. Sobering, but unsurprising. Next slide. Microaggressions were reported to be the most common type of racism that occurs. Next slide. Also, unsurprisingly, the highest number of interactions that we saw, almost 40%, were from people who reported they were unsure if they had even experienced or witnessed racism. Now, that is a very large number of people that are being gaslighted, and no wonder underreporting of racism is a huge problem in the country. Next slide. For those who had reported that they'd experienced racism, they actually started their journey even being unsure if what they went through was racism. So what we saw is that 20% of users went away. They came into Maya Cares, they spoke with her, they left the chatbot, they went around the website, had a look at the various resources, and then in the same interaction, they actually came back to Maya and then they reported racism. So this is a very, very powerful aspect of the way in which technology can enable self-empowerment if you are able to create a digitally safe space. We literally went from people who could not even articulate, users who could not even articulate if they had experienced a problem in the same interaction. This has driven behavior change with them stepping into their power and reporting racism. Next slide. As we mentioned, we never intended to replace existing wellness apps or mental health professionals, but the evidence is that 1 out of 4 users actually want to use Maya to access exercises to process experiences of racism. Typically, you will use apps like the Calm app, or you'll see a mental health professional. As mentioned, this is typically $150 an hour and not very accessible, but this is something that Maya enables. Next slide. To recap on the Humanity First principles, we've talked about moving at the speed of trust. I want to touch on these last 2 points a bit more. Empowering people and communities. People have what's really, really critical, and this is what really was baked into the design of our platform. We know that people have the power to empower themselves. We just have to stop assuming that they don't have that power. If we get out of their way, they can step into their power. Our role is not to speak over communities, but to support from the sidelines. As for safeguarding data and privacy, we must decolonize how we approach research and development, service and product development. What I'd really like to encourage you to consider is, what is your approach when you collect data from people who were not so long ago still being experimented on? How does it avoid repeating harm? For example, where data is the cash of the 21st century, are you paying for the data of vulnerable communities? Last slide. Scaling opportunities. So the first one, we have built a practical solution that decolonizes the humanitarian sector. We've taken a bottom-up approach to ensure racialized people, whether in your organization or who you seek to serve as your stakeholders, are being supported now, whilst all of the other big strategic pieces that enable long-term change, structural change, whilst that is ticking along. But right now, we've got a solution right now. The second opportunity is there's the ability to offer support in a way where the user is in the driver's seat and with dignity. Colonial power imbalances are not being reinforced and perpetuated in the way that we are delivering the services. And finally, this is, I suppose, support for the sector overall, more broadly, where it comes to research and development. What is the approach that you are embedding when you are conducting research and development, research and design services? These are the three different ways in which we are able to support the Red Cross and the sector overall. So thank you for your time today, and I'm really excited to connect with more of you.
Thanks, Priyanka. One of the things Red Cross really enjoys about working with Maya Cares is how much you embody the humanity first principles, which are Humanitech's principles looking at ethical and sustainable technology development. And one of the things that Maya Cares is really leading in is how you're led by lived experience, and everything you do is designed by women from your communities. So you're leading the solution from the front. Can you talk to us a bit about what's been the response from other organisations that are interested in this approach and wanting to solve challenges for vulnerable communities with technology that's been ethically built?
Thanks, Julia, for the question. So I'll answer that in twofold response. So firstly, there are organizations from the humanitarian sector who are wanting to work with us to actually set Maya Cares up within their organization to support the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Black and women of color who work within the organization. And they do not necessarily have access to the psychological safety or the cultural safety, the support that they require to still work within a space that is structurally still highly colonized. So that's a really exciting one. We're working with development organizations in that aspect. Separately, the other use case that has also come up is that other organizations are looking at the innovative way in which we are using the chatbot and the resource library and how they interact with one another to support vulnerable communities who require access to information and services. I can't disclose the exact details, but if we were to use the example of domestic violence, if there is a woman who is in a domestic violence situation at home and is not able to speak to someone, they want to keep their identity confidential, it's really helpful for them to use a platform like this because they're kept anonymous, they're able to access this anytime, anywhere. There's also safety that is being created in the way that we've actually architected the solution. So we don't use their data for anything other than which they've given consent to. And even when we talk about consent, it's built into the very design of the platform. So for example, when you go to speak to Maya, the first thing that she'll say is, "Are you ready? Do you want to proceed?" So this is the way that a therapist would speak to you. And we've been really, really conscious about embedding this into the way that the platform actually interacts with the user. So keeping in mind the extenuating circumstances that would be for someone who is in a difficult and challenging situation and they need to be able to access support in a safe way, this is where other organizations are seeing that this particular method that we've used, this chatbot, as well as this resource library, it really puts the user in the driver's seat to also determine how they want to develop their own journey of solving the problem of healing in relation to whatever the problem might be. So it's not just about women facing racism. It could also apply to people with substance abuse issues. It could apply to domestic violence. It could apply to anyone who's urgently trying to seek information that is otherwise really inaccessible to access.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. We'll move now to our final speaker for this session, Arash Tayabi, to share with us the work of Kara Technologies.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arash. We are from New Zealand. Inside a car, as you can see. And I must say, exactly 10 years ago, I was in Nairobi, and I really love Kenya. So anyone from Kenya really missed that place. So back to reality. So we are from Kara Technologies. And what Kara does is we are making services and content and video accessible to sign language. But instead of using human, we're using digital human. Why are we doing this? Because information services are rapidly increasing every day, and human interpreters cannot keep up with demands. And we are not here to replace the human interpreters. We're here to build a gap. And there are many assumptions that people, including me, made when I was at the beginning of this journey. Is like, a deaf person is able to read in English because they've born in New Zealand or US or whatever. So for a deaf person, spoken language is going to be the second language. So having access to critical information, education material in sign language is very, very important. Next slide. I think we can agree that everybody is so excited about ChatGPT and AI. Our life is going to be really, really cool. To be honest, at Kara, we are worried. Why are we worried? I'll tell you a story. So this is a photo of Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of telephone, which makes us closer together, and we always love him as a great innovator. We told his story to our children. It's fantastic, be like him. But deaf community hates him. His device is supposed to help his deaf wife create a biggest barrier between hearing community and deaf community. Now, if you go and use ChatGPT, it's all in English. Now they're supporting other languages as well. It's not accessible even in sign language. So we believe that the second wave is coming. In fact, the photo that you're seeing of Alexander Graham Bell surfing on a beach is also being created by an AI solution as well. So when we're thinking about how we can harness that power in order to act for accessibility to sign language from day zero, from now. So next slide. Here's what we come across this. This is Alan, one of our digital human, who's signing in New Zealand Sign Language, which is really, really cool. So that's what we mean by digital human providing accessibility. So let's see some of our avatars in action. So can we go? Yeah, so this is one of our avatars. This is one of the projects that we did in Fairfax City in the US. So we made one of the festivals accessible into American Sign Language, which is really great. This is one of the books that we translate into New Zealand Sign Language. It's called The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So spoiler alert, towards the end of the book, when the caterpillars become a butterfly. And also, my internet is upset. And also, avatars come in different shape and forms. So this is a digital twin of a very famous person in Australia called Emma Mema from Wiggles. And we made her digital twin. She can sign and also dance at the same time, which is really, really exciting. Next slide. So one of the things that we always been driven by deaf community. So one of the things that deaf community always asking us is, oh, your solution can help us a lot in emergency situation. We've been very, very privileged to work with Humanitech and Australian Red Cross to validate our solution in Australia. So we did like 3 workshops in 3 big cities. We participate in festivals, and we interview 89 deaf people, and everybody's like, yes, help us to make Australia accessible for emergency solutions. Well, emergency has 2 steps. Step number 1, when you need to be ready, there's some materials that in Red Cross we call ready plan. And the next step that we're looking for is how we can make the emergency notification happening in 3 a.m. in the morning, accessible into sign language. So as a phase 2, we are making the Ready Plan accessible into Australian Sign Language, and we are very keen to see how can we scale it up to other communities, other deaf community globally as well. So next slide. Oh wait, by the way, this is showing our solution in action. So ideally, for example, in the US, because we are heavily involved in that as well, it's compulsory to provide sign language access in case of emergency. It usually take 4 to 6 hours to bring a human interpreter and make the emergency notification into accessible into sign language. With our tech, we can do it less than a minute. So the deaf community will hear it as soon as a hearing community. Again, we're not here to replace the human interpreters. The human can come up and provide more information later on. We're just here to provide fast response when the emergency happens. Thank you. Next slide. And my final thing is, we always constantly guided and learned from the deaf community. So an example that we did in Australia, even before developing a single code, we had the workshop in the deaf community. We employed the people from Australia, deaf community Australia, and we constantly learning from them. Because what we believe in, never develop for somebody, develop with somebody. And it's a no-brainer, and it's very obvious sometimes that we miss. I just want to emphasize and thanks for a deaf community who've been so generous in providing their knowledge to us, so we could create something cool. Thank you very much. That's me.
Thanks, Arash.
Oh, by the way, well, I forget one thing is we have Grace also, our communication manager, available somewhere, I guess, and she's she's the best, top notch when it comes to deaf community and culture, because she's deaf. She has an amazing 2 deaf children. So yeah, I need to acknowledge that. I totally forgot.
Thanks, Arash, and thanks, Grace. Arash, can you tell us a bit about, because I'm sure this has been really exciting for some of our counterparts in other countries that are joining us here today. Can you tell us a bit about the global applications of Humanitech and where you might be looking to go next, particularly around this work with disaster messaging?
Yeah, and because we're a company, for us, it was no-brainer to go to US because of the market size and the number of emergencies happening in United States compared to New Zealand. It's night and day. But also through the World Federation Deaf, we've been in contact with the head of the emergency response, and he told us the stories of, for example, Southeast Asia when the tsunami was happening, and deaf families are being not informed on time, which this application could provide so many helps. There are communities, for example, in Japan, which they rely on their kids, they call their kids to get the information on, and in Europe and even in New Zealand, because we start the whole idea of working emergency when there was a shooting event happened in one of our lovely cities. And sadly, the deaf community would not inform as soon as the others. So in nutshell, we like to be active in certain countries. And what we like to do is we would like to package up and report in such a way that we could give it to the communities globally, so they could develop their own sign language as well. Because one thing to bear in mind, each country has own sign languages. It's not like, oh, we develop something for American Sign Language, it just bam, can work in Europe or in Africa. So each community needs to get involved, and we develop a language, which is making us interesting.
Yeah, interesting and super exciting. Thank you so much, Arash, and thank you to all of our wonderful startup founders for joining us and sharing a bit about the work that they're doing. We can also see Grace from Humanitech on the screen briefly there. And thank you so much to the Global Innovation Summit for inviting us here to share a bit about the work today. I hope it's demonstrated the power of collaboration across the Red Cross network and working with these innovative technologists to both scale the work that we're doing, but also reach the people that need it most. If you're working on solutions that would benefit from collaborating with Red Cross's Humanitech Lab, or if you'd like to connect with any of the startups from today, please reach out to us at Humanitech, and it will be our pleasure to share more with you. The details are up on the screen. And in the link to the chat, there is a link to the Humanitarian Knowledge Vault, which it has been set up by our IFRC for your feedback on the sessions today. So please jump into that and share a bit about your experience. We'll have to leave it there, but reach out to us if you've got any further questions. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day or your night to come along and join with us.